all of us, humans and non-humans, arrived here by some sort of just random process of evolution. And now we happen to find ourselves here. And so we've got to think, okay, well, we find ourselves here. We're aware of the things around us. We're aware of what happens to us. We feel pain. What can we do about this? Half of all pregnancies um, are unintended. They're just mistakes. That is astounding to me, given given the seriousness of what you know procreation is. I would say, like, it's astounding to me that people are so reckless with their behavior that half of pregnancies are unintended. Now, a lot of people believe that humans, for some reason, inherent to humanity, that often they find quite hard to put their finger on, but they believe that humans are superior to animals morally. Thinking about how we relate to other beings is one of the most fundamental questions. And if someone is creating a person and not even thinking about how that will impact the majority of beings on this planet, which is other animals, you know, I don't think I don't think they're thinking about that question very seriously that you just asked. Yes, suffering can have some sort of instrumental benefit, or you can mitigate it, but before you create someone, that there was no one to exist to need to mitigate the suffering. Like, they just didn't exist. And they didn't need the benefits that that may come from the suffering. Once you're here, it's good to contextualize and grow from suffering. But for someone else to choose to put someone in suffering and hope that they grow from it, because there's no guarantee. I mean, look at the world around you. There's billions of people suffering, and it's just meaningless suffering. There's no growth from it. It's just meaningless, pointless. They're just suffering. There's nothing good gonna come from it. I'm gonna make someone so that they can have a good retirement. That doesn't make sense, because there was no one to want the retirement in the first place. So I think that small example just shows a wider thing of, we've got no moral obligation or nothing compelling us to create someone for the good things in life.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Thank you for listening or watching. This is Useful Philosophy Discussions. Today, I have a really interesting and intriguing guest that I'm curious about his thoughts. His name is Lawrence Anton. Hi, Lawrence. Thank you
Hey,
for joining.
hey, no, thanks for having me.
So, I would like to ask you broadly, what is your way of thinking about life, and how you've arrived at it? If you may share a bit of your life experiences that led you to that.
Yeah, so, like, I'll give, yeah, like, a very general answer. So I used to be, maybe sort of like 6 years ago, a very sort of regular person, shall we say, in a Western culture, right? I'm in the UK, um, and when I was on an exchange, like a university exchange, I spent a year studying in Sweden. When I was there, I moved into an apartment, and there was a woman living there who had a dog. And essentially, over time, like, I got to know this dog, and eventually there was a certain point, a certain sort of like thing that happened that made me realize, um, oh, like, I have gotten to know this dog and realized they've got like a personality and they're an individual. And I made the connection that I was also eating animals and paying for them to be killed, right? And so from that point, I became vegan. And it was really at that point that my whole mindset changed. Before that point, I was just a regular guy, from the UK, didn't really critically think about much, I don't think. Um, and becoming vegan really blew my mind open because it made me realize that like I was wrong about such a fundamental thing about reality. Like it was almost like blinders got taken off. And I realized that like before I thought, oh, okay, there's some wars, there's, some people dying of starvation, um, but like we'll work on that over time and hopefully, that'll end. But generally, the world around me is fine and decent, at least in the UK, right? Which is maybe a very sheltered view. But I then, once those blinders got taken off, realized that like all of the people around me, even though they seem to me like ordinary, decent people, like they're all paying for thousands of like these innocent beings to get tortured and killed every year. So that really changed my perspective on reality, and I became a lot more like misanthropic, if you get what I mean. Um, and then really around the same time, I also overheard a conversation with a guy who was talking about antinatalism, which I think is probably what we're going to be mainly talking about today. And I overheard him say, he was replying to someone. He basically said, "Oh yeah, because having children is wrong," or something like that. And I overheard this guy, and I was like, "What? Why would he say that? I don't understand. Like, I've never heard anyone say that before." Anyway, I never got a chance to talk to him, but a few months later, I was in London and I spoke to a friend at an animal rights demonstration. And I didn't actually know at the time, but he was antinatalist, and I didn't realize. But it came up in conversation, and we started to talk about it. And he told me about antinatalism. I gave some sort of like rebuttals or arguments against it, just that I could come up with. And really, I had no good argument against it. He gave me some links to go and watch online, and from that point on I became anti-natalist as well because I just had no good argument against it. So to zoom out and talk about my general, that's sort of how I got to my worldview that I have at the moment. But to actually describe my worldview, or how I see the world, how I see life, as you asked, so I see life as generally like a pointless venture. Like I don't there doesn't seem to be any cosmic overall reason for us to be here. I don't believe there's some sort of God out there that has, given us all some sort of inherent purpose. I just think like we all of us, humans and non-humans, arrived here by some sort of just random process of evolution. And now we happen to find ourselves here. And so we've got to think, okay, well, we find ourselves here. We're aware of the things around us. We're aware of what happens to us. We feel pain. What can we do about this? And through antinatalism, it made me realize that actually there is not really any point of us to continue to create each other. Like, I don't see any benefit to that. And a lot of harm comes from it. Think of every war, every person who's tortured, every child who's on a cancer ward, all of these things. Like, there's really no point for them being there. They were just created, and now those things just happen. And yeah, so I would say that's generally how I see life, which I think is a lot of people see that as like a fairly negative view. I would just say it's a realistic view. But day to day, I'm like quite a positive person, even though my view on things is quite like negative.
Thank you for sharing your story and how your beliefs emerged. It is possible that what we believe isn't really a choice,
Mm,
because when we are confronted with a certain reality and it becomes self-evident, uh, I think it's possible that we really don't have a choice. If
mm,
if we really confront with balls falling all the time, it's a self-evident part of reality. Uh, Eventually, we will stop hoping for balls to be dropped and go up
mm,
in our lives, and kind of get into that expectations matching what
mm,
consistently happens. So it's it's not really surprising to me that people nowadays or even in the past might arrive at natalist way of thought.
Mm.
Um, I was when preparing for our conversation, I was checking my study notes and I found ancient philosopher from ancient Greece
Mm.
talking. His name was Epicurus, and he was very aware that existence involves suffering. He talked about anguish of the soul, which we now understand as the mind being anxious or depressed, and also pain of the body. And most of his work, he wrote about 300 books and many, many letters, was around how to live a life as minimal as possible in terms of anguish and pain
Mm.
and minimize suffering. He even apparently was responding to antinatalists at the time because he said, and I quote, anyone who advises the young to live well and the old to die well is foolish, not only because life is desirable, but also because it is one and the same thing to live well and to die well. Far worse is the man who says that it is good not to be born, but once born to pass with all speed through the gates of Hades.
Mm.
For if he sincerely believes this, why does he not depart life? If he is firmly convinced, he should be prepared to do so. But if he is joking, he is being foolish in matters that do not admit of it. So, of course, I read this dispassionately and without making a judgment. Um, I also have an idea of the context in which this man lived. They lived shortly after Alexander the Great died, and being in the Greek world was in turmoil. People were very anxious about the present and the future. They had a lot of instability, political instability. They were ruled today by leader A, tomorrow by leader B that
Mm.
kills leader A, and they probably a lot of people were growing in numbers, thinking about why should we bring children into this world where they are absolutely certain to suffer a great deal. And I can relate to us thinking this today because after all this advancements, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the 20th century's lessons of two world wars, very deadly and full of pain and suffering world wars
Mm.
that even involved use of nuclear weapons in Japan. Uh, it's kind of expected that some people look at the world and the past with sobriety and thinking well about it, that they start questioning if it is justified, if it's ethical to bring children into the world. Um, and so I won't censor people for thinking about that, but I, as someone who loves to learn about how people think, about the figuring out things,
Mm.
uh, which is literally what a philosopher should aim at, and being devoted to the truth. Um, I I would like to ask questions to pick your brain, basically. So I would like to ask, um, for example, in Japan, there is also no. I'm not sure if they are espousing literally antinatalist beliefs as you've expressed, but there is a tendency in their demographics for very low birth rates right now, and so uh, the effect that this very low birth rate has on their society as at large is the society is transitioning to a society composed of mainly more old people, and so there is a crisis and difficulties in Japanese society, and this is just one example. there's also in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, I think some of this transition, but maybe not so pronounced as
Mm,
in Japan. Uh, is the how would you address this kind of criticism that antinatalism will make the society older, and then it will uh, it will have many sustainability problems as well, because
mm,
after all, old people they get retired, and then the young people need to are the ones who are called to work, basically, to contribute to the retirement of the old people, in a
mm.
sense.
Yeah, I have like two initial thoughts that come to mind. The first one is um, the the sort of falling birth rates that we're seeing in multiple parts of the world, and with that aging populations. The first thing I want to do is sort of separate that out from antinatalism, because I don't think the two are linked in any way. I think antinatalism is still like a very niche, philosophy that very few people have even heard of, let alone subscribe to. I think the falling birth rates we see are due to socioeconomic trends, like people's standard of living increasing. And so they want less children, infant mortality dropping, these sorts of things. So I think antinatalism or no antinatalism, those are trends that we're going to have to deal with. Um, but let's put that aside and say, okay, well, maybe sometime in the future, antinatalism does become, like more well known, and it becomes big enough to actually significantly influence population trends. Um, I don't think that's necessarily like something that antinatalism would need to answer for, just because um, other that this is always going to happen. So if antinatalism were to get to the point where it was very popular and it were to bring about a decline in birth rates and potentially threaten you know or threaten humans with extinction, cause them to go extinct. um I mean, humans are going to go extinct one day anyway. I mean, if if it's not with us killing ourselves with nukes, or the way far down the line, just the heat death of the universe and stuff like that. I mean, humans are going to become extinct at some point, and so antinatalism is not a unique, uh, like what antinatalism may cause, which, to be honest, I don't think it ever will, because I don't think it will ever become that popular. But if it did, it's not causing a unique issue. Like extinction and declining birth rates are going to be something that humans are going to have to deal with anyway. How do I think that we should deal with them when they come? Um, Honestly, I'm not sure. I'm not a demographer. I am not an expert in the care of elderly people. I do admit, though, for antinatalists, it is something that needs to be taken into consideration. If you're advocating for a philosophy that um, at some point may, although I don't think it will, but may cause certain practical issues, then you do need to have a discussion about those practical issues. And one of the things, I run a small YouTube channel, and one of the things I want to, explore on my YouTube channel is how can people without children take care of themselves in old age, or prepare for old age, given that they know that there may not be, they may not have a young person to rely on, for example. Because I do think that's a valid issue that antinatalists have to deal with, as well as other people. There are many people who won't have kids who are not antinatalist for many reasons, maybe personal, or maybe they were just infertile or whatever. So um, yeah, I think that's what I'd say about declining birth rates and aging populations. I think it's caused by many things. None of them at the moment are antinatalism. Out of all of the potential um, reasons, antinatalism is one. Um, but I think this is something that the human species needs to negotiate and have a conversation around anyway, regardless of antinatalism. So I don't think it's necessarily fair to pin this conversation on antinatalism, when yes, the two are linked, but the same question is linked to so many other topics as well.
Yeah, fair enough. As regards to old people finding a way to care about themselves,
Mm,
when they are in their twilights of their lives, Epicurus, actually the same guy, he I think sorted this out because he advocated for people to live in small communities, small communes,
mm,
uh, basically living with your friends. And
mm,
so there was a lot of people, friends taking care of each other. In At that time, he would even accept people that were disenfranchised
mm,
in that ancient Greek society, women and slaves as well. And so he was reviled, and people would talk bad about him and try to pin on him beliefs that didn't even espouse, for doing that, for being an egalitarian and being a compassionate person and doing his best to minimize human suffering. So that was one approach that I found really interesting to minimize human suffering, um, without necessarily throwing antinatalism out of the
mm.
window just yet. It's good to not jump into conclusions too hastily about
Yeah.
systems of thought. It's good to examine them. There's also another school of thought that was really interesting in terms of the human suffering aspect, which is called Stoicism.
Mm,
And contrary to what people commonly think Stoicism is, it's not people uh, being Stoic as in rejecting their feelings. It is examining their feelings.
mm,
And so what could be by default considered unbearable suffering or unnecessary pain or meaningless hardship or pain or whatnot, uh, within a Stoic practice and Stoic way of thought, is actually looked at as fuel for self improvement. There, if this even happened in my life, because when I got my education I studied science in university. So literally, only I mostly sharpened my intellect, but I didn't sharpen my social human skills,
mm,
my people skills, my soft skills. And 10 years into my career, I was working with people from many different walks of life, different fields. um, I was starting to notice that, especially with the pandemic and working in lockdown, and all everyone at the time was working from home, I noticed that it was fairly easy for me to get worked up by contrary stuff to
mm,
what was my expectations, and be kind of an unbearable person. And so in retrospect, I noticed that I've caused unnecessarily pain and suffering to myself and others by kind of panicking at the time. I tried to learn stuff that was more social skills related, and I found Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius's journals. I read
mm,
them several times to really try to figure them out and think about them. And so it's a way of thought that uh, helps us figure out ways to bring meaning into suffering. And so it is very possible that, and it's entirely makes sense that when we are born, our life doesn't come with pre-built meaning. uh, I also don't espouse any mystical
mm,
or monotheistic or collectivist religion beliefs that was left behind in my very early
mm,
phase of life. I was born into Roman Catholicism.
mm,
Uh, my parents, especially my mother, uh, had her beliefs, and she wanted to pass them on. Uh, I frequented Sunday school and went to the traditions and rituals and whatnot, but I had a lot of questions left unanswered, or at least left not satisfyingly answered. And so I left that way of life, but then a gaping hole was left
mm,
because religion kind of gives you a fast food version of philosophy or of
yeah,
meaning, philosophy of life. And so I probably went 2 or 3 decades without anything filling that gap until I found philosophy. And these two philosophies that I've mentioned, Epicureanism and Stoicism, are just two of the constellation of stars or treasures that human beings in the past, probably the most wise and intelligent human beings have put together. And so um, I'm not throwing out the possibility that antinatalism has something valuable to offer. I think so. It has, especially in the part where it questions whether people should allow themselves to bring children into the world
mm,
by chance, by mere chance, just because they love indulging in pleasures like sex without without thinking about the consequences. Of course, sex without anti-conceptive measures is it will bring about children and other possible adverse consequences like STDs.
mm,
Uh, and I think it's really important to inject a lot of rationality into procreation. No doubt about that. There are, unfortunately, many children that are born to seemingly don't have any loving parents caring for them intentionally. Uh, this is something that must be addressed very seriously. There's also the situation of parents that want to have children narcissistically,
mm,
self-centered manner. This is something that, although you didn't mention this directly to me, I also was interacting with some other people who also espouse antinatalism ideas, and so I really think this aspect of antinatalism to prompt people to think very seriously about procreation and not just let procreation happen haphazardly. To really, if people decide to have children, to assume that they're doing entering into an ethical conundrum because
mm.
they're bringing someone to to life without asking their permission, basically.
Yeah,
And yeah,
yeah. If I
go
could
ahead.
just quickly, so on the first thing you said about, a lot of people sort of like being quite thoughtless and reckless uh, with sort of like the possibility of bringing someone into the world. So I didn't actually realize this until recently, but the UN put out a statistic recently. Or I believe it was recently. I saw it recently, but I think they just put it out. Um, that was saying that half of all pregnancies um, are unintended. They're just mistakes, like random. Well, not random, obviously, because you had to have sex, but that yeah, they were unintended. Like that is astounding to me, given given the seriousness of what you know procreation is. I would say, like, it's astounding to me that people are so like reckless with their behavior that half of pregnancies are unintended. Now, that doesn't mean all those pregnancies are going to actually result in a birth, obviously, but just the fact that you're, doing something that is getting to the situation where you have half of them being unintended. That just seems ridiculous to me. And I think it shows, or it speaks to what you were just saying about how people, view this with, um, they don't view it with the gravity that I think it demands. Um, and then the other thing you were saying about how, that people should, one of the things that antinatalism can bring to the conversation is that it will make people realize the gravity of what they're, potentially going to do. And I think you're right. I think if people actually thought about what they were doing, um, from an ethical perspective, they would realize that actually it's a much more significant thing than just having a kid or whatever. Um, like creating someone is literally the most like significant thing that you can do to anyone. Right, it's more significant than anything that will happen once they exist, because when you create someone, you've then just changed the situation fundamentally to, in terms of that person, nothing existing, just empty moral space, to someone existing and being vulnerable to anything that can happen to them. So any bad thing that happens to anyone, ultimately, the person who created them, the parent, is significantly responsible for that, because they set off initially, they initially put in motion the chain of events that eventually led to that person, um, that bad thing happening to that person. Now, obviously, no parent wants a bad thing to happen to their child, but people don't think about it seriously, that if I create someone, I'm now making them vulnerable to anything that can happen in the world. And when they create them, people, you know, if someone, um, if when someone was deciding whether to procreate or not, they were given a list of all the bad things that could happen to their child. In the West, 1 in 3 chance of getting cancer, right? Just that one thing. Like cancer is not a nice thing. Like I've seen someone die from cancer. It's not a nice thing, and I know quite a few people that have had it, and you know, thankfully, like a lot of them have won again their battle against it. But cancer is not a nice thing to have, and it's just one way that humans suffer, just one out of thousands of ways. um, and I don't think anyone listening to this would say that it's a nice thing to just put cancer on someone, or put a 1 in 3 chance of cancer on someone. Like if someone was walking down the street and they for some weird reason were at no risk of cancer, and then you just went up to them and hit them over the head with a magic wand and gave them 1 3 in risk of cancer, made them vulnerable to that, that's a dick move, right? I think anyone would agree with that. But that is what we're doing when we're creating someone. Like there is no one to exist to even want life. Like it's not like people want life. It's not like there's Ricky Gervais said in one of his stand-up routines, he said there's not like some cabinet of ghost fetuses saying we want to be born. There's no one exists to want to be born. We just create people out of nothing. Um and 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 now they have to navigate through life, and there's many bad things in life for them to have to navigate around. So I think if people were, given a list of all the potentially bad things that could happen to their kid in life, with the knowledge that their kid doesn't even want to exist in the first place because they don't exist, I think people would realize the gravity of what they're doing much more.
Yeah, it's very well thought out. It's a good point.
Mm,
I can speak from personal experience. Me and my partner, we decided to have a child, but for what it's worth, we planned very well
mm,
for the child. We did all the necessary medical checkups and whatnot. Our family doctor praised us for being responsible parents
mm,
for what it's worth. And I can speak from experience of being a stepfather beforehand, and now a father.
mm,
it's a little bit like having your heart inside another person,
Mm,
because of course you have your self preservation instincts and desires, but those are also transferred to the child that you brought into the world, assuming you brought that child into the world thoughtfully
mm,
and with reason, with how could I say it? It's difficult to say that you bring a child to the world, since what based on what you've already said, it's difficult to say that I brought a person into the world for a good reason. It's a great question to address and to try to answer, but perhaps one answer that people might think about in
mm,
millennia past is that, okay, we either are good stewards for this earth we find ourselves on, or we exploit it senselessly. And I'm assuming that because of my interest in philosophy and my wish that more people are enthused with philosophy as well, that we little by little gravitate towards being better stewards of what we have. And one aspect of being a good steward of what we take care of is ensuring replacement for ourselves when we die.
mm,
uh, Not in a egotistic sense. I need someone to be myself when I die, or I need immortality. No, I just need to know that things will be taken care of. That transcends my human individual.
mm,
uh, and so, for what it's worth, this is more or less the foundational argument for people to have children with thoughts, since uh, the dawn of human history that I've managed to study. So,
mm. No, no, I understand, and I think the vast majority of reasons that people try to use to justify creating someone are selfish, but I do recognize that there are some reasons that are not selfish, right? And one of those ones is the one that you just said, right? Now, whether that actually justifies the act is a separate thing, but I want to just focus on what you were saying about being, stewards of the earth, essentially. Um, and I actually wanted to ask you a question. So, looking at the relationship we have to nature and wild animals at the moment, to domesticated animals in factory farms, um, do you think that our stewardship, as you termed it, do you think that's actually getting better or worse?
I thank you for posing this question,
Mm,
because I think we are getting much worse at being stewards of the earth.
mm,
Uh, and this can be seen in different levels. Statistically, we are we are forcing into being uh, perhaps trillions of non human animals
mm,
in factory farms. So it's very, very difficult to argue that we are in harmony and in balance with nature. Very, very difficult to argument in favor of that. In fact, it seems that we are massively indulging people to have a lifestyle that involves suffering and
mm,
killing animals in a tremendous scale that is unheard of in all of human history. That's why I think it's not getting better at the moment. Um, and also, uh, do people really need to eat animals every single day, 2 times a day, for all their lives? I seriously doubt it, even if people assume a traditional lifestyle as was held by my ancestors just 3 or 4 generations past, who ate fish or meat like 2 times a month if they were
Mm,
lucky. And these are people that are going to lifespans of 80 to 100 or more years old. So
mm,
these people, they weren't harming their health, not by a long shot, by being very moderate or very sparse with the animals they intake. And today there is, unfortunately, a movement that is basically the protein maximization movement
mm,
that I've witnessed online. Um, these people are arguing with a lot of rhetoric, a lot of poor arguments, but convincing arguments to many people that if you do not eat animals with this rate, this explosive rate, that you will have protein deficits and whatnot.
mm,
And this isn't even approaching the biochemical aspect of nutrition, which is, as you've mentioned, you are vegan. I've also been vegetarian for more than a decade, and I'm also aiming at veganism, though I will probably never consider myself vegan, because when I go to work on my bicycle, I'm absolutely sure I kill without noticing little critters.
mm,
When I boil vegetables, I kill little critters in the vegetables as well. And so I will never be able to say without a doubt that I live without causing pain and suffering and death to other beings with the ability to suffer as well, with nervous systems and whatnot. And so I think these things of our relationship with nature, our relationship with one another, I really think these are very foundational ethical issues that we need to think more deeply about, in contrast to thinking a lot about superficial stuff that is hyped in our society.
mm. Yeah, one thing I want to pick up on is obviously obviously you choose what labels you want to give to yourself, but I don't think you need to to be vegan, you don't need to, not harm any animals. I mean, I think every vegan recognizes that just by existing as a human in modern society, we do harm some animals. Veganism is more of just having the mindset that we want to, as far as is practical and possible, make an effort to remove ourselves from the system of using animals as commodities and harming them and such. So the primary things would be not buying animal products, not buying things tested on animals, etc., etc. But yeah, I don't think you need to go as far as to not boil vegetables or not go on a cycle ride to have the label as of vegan. But obviously it's completely up to you what labels you use. um I think what you were just talking about is also related to antinatalism. There's sort of two broad categories of antinatalism. One is called philanthropic and one is called misanthropic. Now, those are sort of like philosophical terms or whatever, but basically, one means there are reasons to not create someone because of the person you're creating, and there's reasons not to create someone because of the impact on others that creating that person will cause. And you were just talking about like misanthropic sort of things. So or well, you weren't, but it's related to the misanthropic sort of ideas around antinatalism. So one of the one of the main, but not the only, but one of the main reasons that someone who takes a more misanthropic view may not create someone is because of the the harm that that person will do to animals. So I believe over their lifetime, the average person is responsible for the torture, suffering, and death of over 1,000 animals. Now, even if someone is not, vegan, or really thought much about animal ethics before, I think they can recognize that animals clearly matter morally. Like they suffer. They feel what happens to them. They experience it. Um, Now, a lot of people believe that humans, for some reason, inherent to humanity, that often they find quite hard to put their finger on, but they believe that humans are superior to animals morally. Um, the question is, are they 1,000 times more superior to animals? Like I don't think, and given the fact that you're just creating someone, it's not someone who exists already, just creating someone, that didn't need to exist. So you create someone, and that creating someone is a death sentence to thousands of other beings, you know, who can feel pain just as intensely. You take a 2-year-old child to the dentist. you know they may have a bad time because they don't like someone with metal tools in their mouth or whatever, but they can somewhat contextualize it. You take a pig to the dentist, that pig is going to suffer way more. That pig does not have the ability to contextualize that situation. you know they're going to be panicked. They maybe may hyperventilate. They're going to be like, what are these people doing to me? So I think that example of the dentist is just one example of showing that, like, animals can suffer just as vividly as humans in many situations, not in all, but in many situations. And stabbing over 1,000 of them in the throat just so that someone can have a kid, I don't think this is justified. I think that's if someone says that's justified, I think it is their ego talking, and they're sort of disregarding the suffering of animals, I think, unduly. Um, so yeah, I just wanted to say that because I think that's related to what you were saying. You were talking about the fact, you know, thinking about how we relate to other beings is one of the most fundamental questions. And if someone is creating a person and not even thinking about how that will impact the majority of beings on this planet, which is other animals, you know, I don't think I don't think they're thinking about that question very seriously that you just asked.
Yeah, and this isn't a novel way of thought. I can give a few examples to
Mm,
contextualize. There was in ancient India Mahavira, who was one of the teachers of Jainism. He professed his doctrine involved a fundamental tenet which is called ahimsa, and
mm,
ahimsa means harmlessness or nonviolence. And he stressed that this principle of nonviolence or harmlessness applies not just between humans in human relationships, but also to all living beings on Earth.
yep.
Because although perhaps the doctrine might be projected to the overall population with a mystical overtone to simplify things because most of the population isn't philosophical. There is in the writings by Mahavira clearly a tone that shows a realization that of the interconnectedness between us and the rest of nature. As one of the more recent thinkers called Jacques Fresco would say, we don't really see the plug coming out of our ass, connecting us to the rest of nature. But if you remove the oxygen from the atmosphere, we die. If you remove the plant life, we die. If you turn out the sun, the plants will die, and then we'll die. And so we are here thanks to our overall nature surrounding us.
Mm,
And perhaps we take a lot of these things that are basically boons conceded to us by nature. We take it for granted without examining this fortune that we have. Of Although I agree with you, and Siddhartha, who was a contemporary of Mahavira, also in ancient India, who founded Buddhism,
mm,
he also realized, not soon in his life, but after he left his protective cocoon of indulgence and luxury that his father created for him, in an attempt to groom him to be a militaristic conqueror.
mm,
Um, the prophecy said he would be that, or either a spiritual teacher. And upon realizing, by doing little sorties out of his palace, he realized that suffering is a very real thing in the world. There are people getting ill, sick, people dying. There are people fasting because they don't want to participate in the norms of society, and they want to just be as harmless as possible to the world. And he left and he submitted himself to 6 years of a very hardcore asceticism,
mm,
uh, much mortification by fasting, eating a grain of rice per day, and drinking his own urine, basically, with these ascets. So he really examined suffering very intensely in his life, and the contrast, I believe, between a life of luxury and indulgence and sense pleasure excesses of his earlier life, and these 6 years of suffering and pain, they really helped his mind focus on what matters in life. And so his lessons revolve around, okay, life involves suffering unavoidably. There is no there is no way around that.
mm,
Suffering will come, uh, and pain will come. It's unavoidable, but you can train your mind. You can do your best to be an ethical person toward others, and be a resilient mind to to take this suffering and pain. And instead of amplifying it out into the world, as many do, as more pain and suffering, you turn it into goodness. And I believe that is possible. I've witnessed other people as well that are intellectual descendants from
mm,
Siddhartha. Arguably, when Alexander the Great, which is not so great, he's Alexander the Macedon and the conqueror, the bloodthirsty, when
mm,
he conquered until northern India. This was about a century after Siddhartha's life. He took a philosopher, and at least one philosopher called Pyrrho, who met what he was calling the gymnosophists, which literally means the naked sages, which were intellectual descendants or disciples of Siddhartha, who taught him to question things. And so he became the very first skeptic. He brought many concepts, and we are not sure what kind of information was exchanged, what kind of lessons were exchanged. He basically returned to Greece, to Europe, basically to the Western world, and infused the Western world with this inspiration from ultimately Siddhartha and these ancient traditions of self-improvement. And so what came after was these Epicureanism, skepticism, Stoicism, and cynicism, mainly these branches of thought, these doctrines that have a very big bent on working to improve yourself in terms of character,
mm,
building a better character, being don't not being a bad person to other people, in a sense. And in not being a bad person to others and being at peace with yourself, you, for one thing, reduce the amount of suffering you self-generate in your mind through your thoughts. Many people generate suffering senselessly by perpetuating negative thoughts within themselves. And so, by training your own mind through rituals, practices, or habits, what have you, whatever you want to name them, you can little by little transcend the suffering in the world, in a sense that you build a tougher skin to take it, for one. But when you reach a certain critical level, besides taking in the suffering, you will transmute the suffering into kindness, into goodness, into compassion. And so, although I cannot refute antinatalism, I can at least give uh, other ideas that
Mm,
might complement antinatalism, so that we as human beings, since we are already here, at least we are here living a good life, in the sense that we are our best to ourselves, to other human beings, and to life in general, to nature in general, to other non-human animals. And we don't need to start from scratch in this path. We can learn from the best that there were. And so uh, I would I'm just rambling here, but I would also like to
mm.
know what you feel and think about this.
Yeah, no, I agree with you that I think Buddhism has a lot to offer people, and I agree with you. I think a lot of the suffering that people go through um, is self-generated by allowing their thoughts to control them and not grounding themselves in the moment and concentrating on something like the breath or et cetera, et cetera. These sort of fundamental teachings that Buddhism brought in are being, popularized by people like, Alan Watts or even more, contemporary, like people like Sam Harris with his app, the Waking Up app. And so I agree. I think these practices are very good for, people who are already here. I 100% agree with that. I think how it relates to antinatalism. So, um, once you exist, there are ways to mitigate suffering. Obviously, just stop yourself from going through suffering in the first place, and that may be like what we've just talking about. Being able to control your thoughts and stuff like that, or have more control over your mind or perceived control. Um, Another one is to contextualize the suffering or to use it for instrumental good. So um, someone could say, I've been through suffering, but it has made me grow as a person, and so actually through suffering, overall I've benefited. And again, I agree. I think once someone exists, all of those things can be true, and they can actually be healthy as well. Um, where I sort of deviate from mainstream thought on this, which is linked to antinatalism, is um, yes, once you exist, suffering can be all these things, but that is not a reason or an excuse to create someone. Because, yes, suffering can have some sort of instrumental benefit or you can mitigate it, but before you create someone, that there was no one to exist to need to mitigate the suffering. Like, they just didn't exist. And they didn't need the benefits that come from that may come from the suffering. Um, so, for example, someone may say, uh, you know, I have I have spent my whole life working, and it hasn't been amazing, but it's been fine. But now I really get to enjoy my retirement. You know. So, and they've earned that through working. So someone could say, I've gone through this suffering of working, but overall it's going to be good because I'm really going to enjoy this retirement. I've set myself up well. That makes sense once someone exists. But if someone said, I'm going to create someone so that they can have a nice retirement, that doesn't make sense, right? Because there's no one to exist to want the retirement in the first place. So I agree. Once you're here, um, it's good to contextualize and grow from suffering. But for someone else to choose to put someone in suffering and hope that they grow from it, because there's no guarantee. I mean, look at the world around you. There's billions of people suffering, and it's just meaningless suffering. There's no growth from it. It's just meaningless, pointless. They're just suffering. There's nothing good gonna come from it. Um, to put someone into that and hope that they will grow from it, um, I don't see the point of it. I think it's reckless. I don't think it's justified. Um, and yeah, I don't think it's a reason to create someone. Um, and I know that we've already spoken a lot, and we haven't actually touched on the core fundamentals of antinatalism and sort of laid them out. So I kind of want to maybe do that now quickly,
Go ahead.
um, for some people that are wondering, and it's related to what we were just talking about. So the way um, the way that I see it, there are some sort of core uh, ideas or concepts around, like, behind antinatalism. So the first one is our sort of relationship to good things and bad things, or benefits and harm, pleasure and pain, however you want to put them. So once someone exists, like you and me, or anyone watching this or listening to this, clearly, it is good if we get good things, or have, pleasure, or some sort of benefit is bestowed on us. These are good things, right? Wisdom, knowledge, the meaningfulness, all of this sort of stuff. And there are bad things that are bad as well, obviously, pain, ignorance, you know, these sort of things, having some sort of, mental impairment. So, there are good things and bad things, but the situation is somewhat different, when we're thinking about creating someone. Now, in the antinatalist view, it doesn't make sense to create someone for the quote unquote good things in life. Like I was saying to you before, someone could say, you know, I'm going to make someone so that they can have a good retirement. That doesn't make sense, because there was no one to want the retirement in the first place. So I think that small example just shows a wider thing of, we've got no moral obligation, or nothing compelling us to create someone for the good things in life. But actually, it's different on the flip side. If someone said, I'm not going to create someone because I know that they're going to have a horrible life, maybe I'm going to pass some genetic disease onto them, that does make sense. Even though there's no one who currently exists to want to avoid the pain, it still makes sense to us to say, yeah, I'm not going to create someone because I know they're going to suffer in the future. And so there's an asymmetry there in how we view goods and bads, or harms and benefits, from the point of view of creating someone, which is separate from someone who already exists. Um, and and I think this does inform relatively common sense views that people hold. So many people will agree that if you have a couple who's guaranteed to have a happy child, no one says that, or it's not a common belief for someone to say those people have to have a child, like they're morally obliged. Like, people just say if they want to, then it's good the child has a happy life, but they're not obliged, right? Um, but if there's a couple who is equally certain that if they have a child, that child's going to suffer, well, then people do take a strong view and say, no, you shouldn't create that person. They don't say, oh, well, it doesn't matter, you create them if you want. No, people say, no, you have an obligation not to create that person. And so I think, actually, most people, if you talk to them about this, maybe putting aside maybe like people who have strong religious views, which I think the religious views are mistaken anyway, but that's kind of separate. Um, I think many people will actually agree with antinatalism until you actually explain where it leads. And then they think, oh, well, actually, I want to create someone. And I think their ego gets involved, and their cultural sort of, you know, um, if indoctrination isn't too strong a word, um, gets involved, and they get a bit of cognitive dissonance there. So that's a core sort of idea around antinatalism, is that we don't have a reason to create someone for the good things, but we do have a reason not to create someone because of the bad things. And so that skews us towards, okay, well, we should just not create someone. Um, and there was a there's a philosopher called David Benatar who you may have come across when you were doing research or reading about antinatalism. He was the person who sort of first formalized this asymmetry, but he also uses an analogy which I think is quite useful, because I think some people still maybe can't get their head around the idea of, well, but if someone exists, they get to have a good life. And I think some people find it hard to understand why actually that isn't an advantage over someone who never exists. So um, he uses the analogy of, if you call them like two people, call them sick and healthy, right? So sick is, this person who is prone to getting ill. They get sick quite regularly, but they have the capacity to recover from illness very quickly, right? So this is obviously good for them, to have this capacity to get better quickly. And you also have this person called healthy. Now, healthy does not have the capacity to recover from illness quickly, but healthy also never becomes ill. And so, is it an advantage that sick has the capacity to get better quickly? Is that an advantage they have over healthy? Well, I think most people would say no, because even though sick has this beneficial capacity that's beneficial to them, it's not an advantage over healthy, because healthy has no need for that capacity in the first place. Now, how does this relate to antinatalism? Well, people who exist clearly have a capacity for enjoying things and having good experiences, right? And that is good for them given they exist. But it's not an advantage over the counterfactual situation that they never existed, because they would have no need for that capacity in the first place. They'd have no desire for the good things, etc., etc. So, for example, um, was the year 1756 a bad year for you? Well, you would just say it was nothing because you didn't exist, right?
Yeah, I have
Yeah,
no experience of it.
exactly. And so people tend to get attached to the life that they have now. And when an antinatalist says, actually, it would have been better if you were never created, the person doesn't imagine themselves never being created. They imagine themselves being removed now from reality, because they're looking at it from the point of view of someone who already exists. And so I like to ask people the question, which I learned this question recently from a friend of mine, that I just asked you, like, okay, well, what was it like for you in the year 1756? And people say, well, it wasn't anything. I didn't experience it, was nothing. And that's exactly the point. That if we think of it in that way, that is the perspective of someone who never existed, or someone who never existed. You know, I think people um, they find it quite hard to think about antinatalism because we could become so attached to the experience and the life that we have now.
That's a really interesting thought experiment. I think I've thought about it not concisely to a year, but we as human beings, thanks to our progresses in science,
Mm,
uh, and also metaphysics from the ancient world, people were already talking about. There is literally an eternity before us. There's a little sliver of our life, and then there's a vast eternity after us, and there is no telling whether it's infinite or not, and
mm,
possibly it is, or maybe it is an infinity that circles around or whatever, and so it's only apparently an infinity, just like our Earth is apparently flat, just because we are small compared to it.
mm,
Uh, who knows? We also do not know fundamentally what is really happening for us to have minds and to be experiencing the cosmos. Me by my viewpoint, and you by your viewpoint, we don't know why there is such a concrete and specific correspondence. And we are not apparently connected, but we have two minds which are apparently the same kind of phenomenon happening. We do not know if it's an epiphenomenon uh, of the brain, that if you remove the brain, the mind just dissipates because it
Mm.
was dependent on the brain, like a generator or a computer generates the operative system working, or whether the brain is kind of like a radio receiver, and if the brain is destroyed, the signal is somewhere in the void or the cosmos or the ether, whatever.
Mm.
We have no idea. So I think it's really important to state that fundamental aspects of the cosmos uh, are still without answers, and probably will remain without answers. It's also really important to realize that uh, since we are here, it is our privilege and our freedom of will to make the best of it, not in the sense of exploiting nature senselessly and indulging our vices and whatnot, because that will just burn the entire landscape of the planet unavoidably. This is the utmost consequence of turning our ambitions outward. However, we can also turn our ambitions inwardly, like some of these wise persons I mentioned previously, to improve our self knowledge. Perhaps by improving our self knowledge, we might figure out what these unanswered questions that I was mentioning just now about our minds, our human nature, and our fundamentals of human nature and the cosmos. What do they mean, and how do they interrelate? um, and perhaps we can figure out ways to improve our societies and our lives. Not I'm not wishful thinking here, because I know it's an insurmountable task.
Mm.
And also, I was in my previous life, my previous years, an activist. I wanted to help expose the ills of the financial and economic system and change the world. I was, the young adulthood and teen years, where we haven't yet figured out society, and we are revolted with how society works. And so we try to do something about it. We kind of uh, go in a journey of discovery and flail aimlessly.
Mm.
uh, but I think our infinite ambition should not be turned outward. I cannot stress this enough. If we continue to expand our population, um, as it has been expanding in the past 200 years explosively, and continue to turn our infinite ambition outwards, that it will never be satisfied with itself. There are people that literally are aiming to conquer the entire earth. I don't even need to mention their names, and some
Mm.
people will know who they are. Um, and still, even if they were to conquer the entire planet and rule over it, with their narcissistic personality, they would still be thinking that they only have a small backyard that is unsatisfactory for them. They would never be satisfied, even with the entire planet.
Mm.
Uh, Even if they spread out to the rest of the cosmos, they still wouldn't be satisfied. And so, if you're not satisfied with your backyard that is poorly managed anyway, why spread your poor management practices
Mm.
beyond your backyard or beyond your room? So this is something that I gleaned from Thomas More's Utopia. He would criticize these conquerors of Europe that were managing their country as it were, what they had anyway, and they were still with ambitions to spread out. So uh, I think the what you shared here is valuable. I myself probably will never espouse antinatalism, but I can give you the credit that it really is important to give food for thought. I think it's really important to think about the ethical ramifications of bringing new people into the world. Think very seriously about that. If people uh, do have children, to plan very thoughtfully about it, to really think what they are doing, and if they are doing something at least minimally sustainably, so we can at least become somewhat satisfactory stewards of this planet we find ourselves upon. Any final thoughts, Lawrence?
Yeah, no, no, I would just say if people are interested in learning more about antinatalism, I would definitely recommend. Probably the best place to start would be just typing into YouTube David Benatar, and quite a few, interviews and stuff will come up. Like I mentioned before, I run a small YouTube channel, so you can find that on YouTube. It's Lawrence Anton. Um, so there's plenty of things out there for people who are interested in this um, to yeah find out more. And I would just say, to add on to the back of what you were saying, I do recognize that like most people are still going to procreate, and so the only thing that I would say to those people is, um, if you do choose to do that, I hope that your kid is lucky and does have an amazing life whilst they're here. And yeah, just try to raise them as being a critical thinker and someone whose um, life purpose is to improve the world for others. um, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Lawrence, very much. Not just for these final remarks, but for the whole thoughts that you shared in this podcast. Um, for everyone watching or listening, the all relevant links from Lawrence will be found in the description. And so, thank you all so much for watching and listening. And see you next time. See you, Lawrence. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye bye.